What do you do when an anonymous text at 4:47 p.m. tells you your wife is in a hotel room with another man, and when you arrive to find her car in the parking garage, you realize someone with inside knowledge wanted you to catch her, but you don't know who sent the message or why they chose today? My name is Ethan Cross, and I have spent the last 4 years of my life working as a fitness instructor at Summit Peak Gym in the kind of suburban neighborhood where people drive luxury SUVs to yoga classes and pay premium membership fees for the privilege of running on treadmills that face floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a carefully landscaped courtyard that was designed to make exercise feel like a retreat rather than a chore. I teach morning spin classes and afternoon strength training sessions to clients who range from stay-at-home parents trying to reclaim their pre-children bodies to corporate executives who schedule their workouts with the same precision they apply to their quarterly earnings calls. And over the years, I have developed a reputation for being calm and methodical, and someone who never raises his voice even when clients show up late or spend half the session checking their phones instead of focusing on proper form and breathing techniques. Before I became a fitness instructor, I spent 6 years in the military working as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation facility where I helped soldiers recover from injuries sustained in training accidents and overseas deployments. And that experience taught me how to read people's bodies and recognize patterns in the way they move and the way they compensate for pain or weakness that they are trying to hide from themselves and from the medical staff who are monitoring their progress. The military also taught me how to remain calm under pressure and how to gather information systematically before making decisions that could have serious consequences. And those skills have served me well in my civilian life, even though I rarely talk about my background, because most people at the gym are more interested in discussing their workout routines and their meal prep strategies than in hearing stories about my time in uniform. I have been married to my wife Lisa for 7 years. And for most of that time, I believed that we had built a stable and comfortable life together based on mutual respect and shared goals, even if we did not experience the kind of passionate romance that people write songs about, or the kind of dramatic conflicts that provide material for therapy sessions and late-night arguments about whose turn it is to apologize first. Lisa works as a marketing consultant for various small businesses in the area, and she has always been ambitious and image-conscious in ways that sometimes make me feel like I am not quite polished enough or successful enough to match the lifestyle she envisions for herself, but I have tried to support her career aspirations and her desire to build a social network that includes the kind of people who can open doors and create opportunities for professional advancement. Lisa joined Summit Peak Gym about 2 years ago, when she decided that she needed to take her fitness more seriously and that working out at home was not providing her with the structure and accountability she needed to maintain a consistent routine. And I remember feeling pleased that my wife would be exercising at the same facility where I worked because it meant we would have another activity to share and another context in which we could intersect during our otherwise busy and separate days. I did not teach Lisa's classes because we both agreed that it would be awkward to have me correcting her form or pushing her through difficult sets in front of other gym members who might make jokes about the instructor being too hard on his wife or too easy on her, depending on how they interpreted our interactions. So Lisa attended sessions taught by other instructors, and we would occasionally see each other in passing when I was moving between the staff room and the main workout floor. The text message arrived at exactly 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon, while I was sitting in my car in the gym parking lot reviewing notes for the next day's client sessions and trying to decide whether I had enough energy to stop at the grocery store on my way home or whether I should just order takeout and deal with the shopping tomorrow. My phone vibrated in the cup holder beside me, and when I picked it up, I saw that the message was from an unknown number without a name attached, which immediately struck me as unusual because I am careful about giving out my phone number, and most of the communication I receive comes from established contacts whose information is already stored in my phone with proper labels and profile pictures. I opened the message expecting to see some kind of spam advertisement or a wrong number text that was meant for someone else. But instead, I found myself reading 8 words that seemed to freeze the air in my lungs and make the familiar parking lot around me feel suddenly strange and threatening. The message said, "Your wife is at the Hilton, room 1757. There was no additional context or explanation, no signature or indication of who had sent it or why they thought I needed this information. And for several long seconds, I simply stared at the screen, trying to process what I was reading and whether it could possibly be some kind of mistake or prank or bizarre coincidence that had nothing to do with my actual wife, Lisa. I looked at the timestamp on the message and confirmed that it had been sent at 4:47 p.m., which was less than a minute ago. And then I looked at the unknown number and tried to determine if there was anything familiar about the digits or the area code that might give me a clue about the sender's identity. My first instinct was to call Lisa and ask her where she was and what she was doing, but even as I reached for the favorites list on my phone, I stopped myself because I realized that if the message was accurate and Lisa was indeed at the Hilton with someone else, Then calling her would only alert her to the fact that someone had informed me of her location and would give her time to construct an explanation or to leave before I could verify what was happening. I sat with my hand hovering over the phone screen while my mind raced through the various possibilities and implications, and I tried to remember what Lisa had told me this morning about her plans for the day when we had briefly crossed paths in the kitchen while I was making coffee and she was gathering her work materials and preparing to leave the house. I closed my eyes and replayed the morning conversation in my mind, and I remembered that Lisa had mentioned she was attending her cousin Julia's baby shower this afternoon, which was supposed to take place at a restaurant across town and was scheduled to run from approximately 2 o'clock until 5 or 6, depending on how long the games and gift opening portions of the event lasted. Lisa had been looking forward to the shower for several weeks and had spent considerable time selecting an appropriate gift and coordinating with her mother and sister about who would bring what contributions to the party, so the idea that she would skip the event or leave it early to go to a hotel with someone seemed completely inconsistent with everything I knew about her priorities and her family relationships. I opened my eyes and looked at the phone again, and I noticed that while I had been processing the message, a new notification had appeared at the top of my screen indicating that there was activity on our shared credit card account. I tapped the notification and waited for the banking app to load, and when the transaction history appeared, I felt a cold wave of recognition wash over me as I read the most recent entry, which showed a charge of $89 to the Hilton Hotel, posted at 4:22 p.m., with Lisa's name listed as the cardholder. The charge description included the words room upgrade, which suggested that Lisa had not simply met someone in the hotel lobby or restaurant, but had actively paid for accommodations using our joint account, and the timestamp indicated that the transaction had occurred less than 30 minutes ago, which meant that whatever was happening was still in progress. I sat in my car trying to decide what to do next, and I found myself thinking about the tactical training I had received during my military service and the importance of gathering accurate intelligence before taking action based on incomplete or potentially misleading information. The anonymous text and the credit card charge certainly suggested that Lisa was at the Hilton and that she was there for reasons that she had not disclosed to me, but I recognized that there could still be innocent explanations that I had not considered, and that rushing to confrontational conclusions without visual confirmation would be premature and potentially damaging to my marriage if I was misinterpreting the situation. I started my car and pulled out of the gym parking lot. And as I drove toward the Hilton, which was located approximately 15 minutes away in the downtown business district, I tried to maintain the same calm, analytical mindset that I used when working with rehabilitation patients who were frustrated by their lack of progress and needed someone to help them focus on measurable data rather than emotional reactions. I told myself that I was simply going to verify Lisa's location and gather additional information before deciding how to respond, and that maintaining control over my own emotions and reactions was essential to handling whatever I was about to discover with the kind of strategic clarity that the situation would require. The Hilton parking garage was a multi-level structure attached to the hotel's main building, and as I drove up the entrance ramp and began searching for Lisa's silver SUV among the hundreds of vehicles parked in the dim, fluorescent-lit spaces, I felt my heart rate increasing despite my efforts to remain calm and focused. I circled through the first level without seeing any familiar vehicles, and then I continued up the ramp to the second level, where I again failed to locate Lisa's car among the neat rows of sedans and trucks and minivans that belonged to hotel guests and business travelers and people attending conferences in the meeting rooms on the hotel's lower floors. I was beginning to wonder if perhaps the anonymous text had been incorrect, or if Lisa had parked somewhere else nearby when I reached the third level of the garage and spotted her silver SUV parked in a space near the elevator bank in a location that would be convenient for someone who wanted to minimize the distance between their vehicle and the hotel entrance. I pulled into an empty space several rows away where I would have a clear view of Lisa's car but would not be immediately visible to anyone approaching from the elevator. And then I turned off my engine and sat looking at the familiar vehicle with its yoga studio bumper sticker and its small dent in the rear quarter panel from the time Lisa had backed into a shopping cart at the grocery store. I took my phone from my pocket and opened the camera app, and then I stepped out of my car and walked casually toward Lisa's SUV while appearing to anyone who might be watching like I was simply another hotel guest heading toward the elevator. When I reached Lisa's vehicle, I noticed that there was a small, rectangular paper ticket tucked under the driver's side windshield wiper, and I recognized it as the kind of valet parking receipt that hotels provide to guests who choose to have their vehicles parked by attendants rather than searching for spaces themselves in the self-park garage. I positioned my phone carefully and took several photographs of the valet ticket, making sure that the timestamp printed on the receipt was clearly visible in the frame. And I noted that according to the printed information, Lisa's vehicle had been dropped off by the valet service at 4:35 p.m., which aligned with the credit card charge timeline and confirmed that she had arrived at the hotel within the past half hour. I returned to my car and sat reviewing the photographs I had just taken, and I felt a strange sense of detachment as I observed myself behaving exactly like the kind of suspicious spouse that I had always pitied in movies and television shows, gathering evidence and documenting details instead of simply trusting the person I had married, and giving her the benefit of doubt that there might be reasonable explanations for why she was at a hotel on a Thursday afternoon when she had told me she would be at a family baby shower across town. I remained in my car for several minutes considering my options and trying to decide whether I should confront Lisa immediately by going up to room 1757 and knocking on the door, or whether I should wait in the parking garage to see if she emerged with whoever she was meeting and gather visual confirmation of exactly what kind of situation I was dealing with before making any decisions about how to proceed. The military training that still influenced my thinking even years after my discharge told me that patience and observation were usually more valuable than impulsive action, and that having complete information before engaging with a target was the difference between a successful operation and a chaotic mess that created more problems than it solved. I decided that waiting in the lobby would give me a better vantage point than sitting in the parking garage, because the lobby would allow me to observe anyone coming down from the upper floors, while also giving me the option to retreat or reposition if the situation became uncomfortable or if I needed time to process what I was witnessing before deciding how to respond. I locked my car and walked toward the elevator bank, and as I rode down to the ground floor, I practiced the kind of controlled breathing techniques that I taught to my fitness clients when they were pushing through difficult exercises and needed to manage their stress responses and maintain focus despite physical discomfort or mental fatigue. The Hilton lobby was decorated in the standard corporate style that all mid-range business hotels seem to favor, with neutral colors and comfortable seating arrangements, and a long front desk where several employees in matching uniforms were checking guests in and out while maintaining the professional smiles that hospitality workers are trained to display regardless of how they might actually be feeling about their jobs or their interactions with demanding customers. I positioned myself near the concierge desk in an area that gave me a clear view of the elevator doors, while also allowing me to appear like I was simply waiting for someone or reviewing messages on my phone, and I tried to adopt the relaxed posture of someone who belonged in this space and had every right to be standing here without attracting attention or questions from the hotel staff. I had been waiting for approximately 20 minutes and was beginning to wonder if perhaps Lisa and whoever she was with had decided to remain in the room for an extended period when I heard the distinctive chime that announced an elevator arriving at the lobby level. And I looked up from my phone to see the doors sliding open to reveal my wife standing next to a man whose face I recognized immediately, even though it took my brain several seconds to process the recognition and understand the full implications of what I was seeing. The man was Derek Hale, who was the business partner of Paul Sinclair, the owner of Summit Peak Gym where I worked and where Lisa had been a member for the past 2 years, and Derek was someone I had encountered dozens of times in the gym environment, where he would occasionally show up to meet with Paul about franchise expansion plans or financial projections or marketing strategies that they hoped would increase membership numbers and boost revenue. Derek was in his early 40s and carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that comes from having money and social status, and the belief that the world generally operates in ways that favor people like him, and I had always found him slightly irritating in the way that he would walk through the gym as though he owned the place, even though technically Paul was the franchise holder, and Derek was simply an investor who had provided capital in exchange for a partnership stake. I watched as Lisa and Derek stepped out of the elevator together, and I noticed that Lisa was laughing at something Derek had just said, and that her body language suggested a level of comfort and familiarity that went far beyond what I would have expected from a casual business acquaintance or a fellow gym member who she might have run into accidentally at a hotel. They were both holding coffee cups that appeared to be from the in-room coffee service that hotels provide for guests, and Lisa was carrying her purse over one shoulder in the relaxed way that suggested she was in no particular hurry and was enjoying whatever conversation she was having with Derek. I remained standing near the concierge desk watching them approach, and I felt a strange sense of disconnection, as though I was observing this scene from outside my own body, or watching a movie in which I happened to be one of the characters, but not the one controlling the narrative, or making decisions about how the plot would unfold. Lisa and Derek were walking directly toward the main lobby exit, which meant they would pass within 10 feet of where I was standing, and I knew that within the next few seconds they would notice me and would have to make some kind of acknowledgement or decision about how to react to my unexpected presence. I did not move from my position or make any attempt to hide, and I maintained the same neutral expression that I used when observing clients during training sessions and waiting to see if they would maintain proper form or if they would start to compromise their technique as fatigue set in. The moment when Lisa's eyes met mine was so brief that someone watching from across the lobby might have missed it entirely, but I saw the exact instant when recognition flickered across her face and when the relaxed smile she had been wearing transformed into something frozen and uncertain. She stopped walking so abruptly that Derek took another 2 steps before he noticed that she was no longer beside him, and then he turned back with a confused expression and followed her gaze to where I was standing with my phone in my hand and my body language deliberately calm and non-threatening, despite the fact that my pulse was hammering in my ears. Derek's face registered surprise and then what looked like concern or possibly alarm, as he apparently understood that he was looking at Lisa's husband and that this encounter was not something that had been anticipated or planned for in whatever script he and Lisa had been following. I watched Derek's expression shift through several different emotions in the space of about 3 seconds, and I could almost see him trying to calculate what explanation would be most effective in diffusing the situation and allowing everyone to move forward without acknowledging the obvious implications of a married woman and a man who was not her husband emerging together from a hotel room in the middle of the afternoon on a day when the woman had told her husband she would be somewhere else entirely. Derek recovered his composure first and began walking toward me with his hand extended in the kind of gesture that businessmen use when they want to establish dominance or frame an interaction as casual and friendly, and when he reached me he said something about what a coincidence it was to run into me here and how he and Lisa had been having a meeting to discuss some marketing consultation work that Lisa was doing for the gym's social media strategy. His voice had the practiced smoothness of someone who was accustomed to talking his way through uncomfortable situations, and I noticed that he maintained eye contact while he spoke, as though daring me to challenge his explanation or to suggest that there was anything inappropriate about 2 professional colleagues meeting at a hotel in the middle of a workday. Lisa had followed Derek over to where I was standing, and she had apparently decided to support his narrative by adding details about how they had needed a quiet space to review marketing materials and analytics reports, and how the hotel had seemed like a convenient location because it was roughly halfway between her home office and the gym. She explained that they had been working in the business center on the 2nd floor and had just taken a break to get coffee and were actually on their way out, to grab a late lunch before finishing up their review of the campaign strategy they had been developing. I listened to both of them speak without interrupting, and I maintained the same calm, neutral expression that I had been wearing since the moment they had stepped off the elevator. When they had both finished offering their explanations and the silence had stretched out for several seconds while they waited for me to respond, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, and I opened the banking app and turned the screen so that Lisa could see the transaction history showing the $89 room upgrade charge that had been posted to our shared credit card at 4:22 p.m. I did not say anything as I held up the phone, and I watched Lisa's face as she looked at the screen and understood that whatever explanation she and Derek had prepared was already contradicted by the documented evidence of a hotel room charge rather than a business center rental or a coffee shop receipt. The color drained from Lisa's face in a way that reminded me of patients I had worked with in the military, who had just received news about the severity of their injuries and were processing the gap between what they had believed about their condition and what the medical reality actually was. Derek looked at the phone screen and then looked at Lisa, and I saw something shift in his expression as he apparently realized that Lisa had used a shared credit card to pay for the room, and that this detail was going to make it much more difficult to maintain the fiction that they had been meeting for innocent professional purposes. He started to say something else about how there must be some confusion and how perhaps Lisa had paid for the room so they could have a private space for their meeting without distractions, but his voice trailed off when he saw that I was not responding to his words and was simply standing there holding the phone and waiting for one of them to acknowledge reality. I lowered my phone and put it back in my pocket, and then I looked directly at Lisa without acknowledging Derek at all, and I said in the same calm voice I used when teaching fitness classes that I would be going home now and that she should take whatever time she needed to finish her meeting or her work session or whatever she wanted to call this situation. I told her that we would talk later when she got home, and then I turned and walked toward the lobby exit without waiting for either of them to respond or to try to stop me or to offer any additional explanations that would only make the situation more complicated. As I walked through the automatic doors and out into the afternoon sunlight, I was aware that several other people in the lobby had been watching our interaction, including the concierge whose desk I had been standing near, and at least 2 guests who had been sitting in the seating area and who had probably overheard at least parts of the conversation. I knew that the story of whatever they had witnessed would likely spread through the hotel staff and possibly beyond, but I found that I did not particularly care about the opinions of strangers who had no stake in my marriage or my life. I walked back to the parking garage and got into my car, and as I drove home I found myself thinking about the anonymous text message that had alerted me to Lisa's location at the Hilton and wondering who had sent it and why they had chosen to inform me rather than simply keeping silent and allowing Lisa's affair to continue without my knowledge. The text had included the specific room number, which suggested that the sender was someone who had access to detailed information about Lisa's activities, and the timing of the message had been precise enough that I had arrived while Lisa and Derek were still at the hotel, which meant that whoever sent it had wanted me to witness the situation firsthand rather than simply learning about it secondhand through rumors or speculation. I realized that someone had deliberately orchestrated this exposure, and that they had calculated the timing and the method of notification to ensure maximum impact and to force me to confront the reality of Lisa's betrayal in a way that would be undeniable and documented. The question that occupied my mind as I drove through the familiar streets toward home was not whether Lisa was having an affair, because the evidence of that was now clearly established, but rather who had decided that I needed to know about it today and what their motivations were for intervening in my marriage at this particular moment. I arrived home approximately 30 minutes after leaving the Hilton, and I spent the first several minutes after walking through the front door simply standing in the kitchen, trying to decide what I should do next and whether I should wait for Lisa to return home with whatever explanation she had prepared during her drive, or whether I should take some kind of proactive step to gather additional information that might help me understand how long this situation had been going on and what the full scope of Lisa's deception actually was. The house felt different somehow, even though nothing had physically changed since I had left for work that morning, and I found myself noticing small details that I had probably walked past dozens of times without really seeing them, like the framed wedding photo on the wall that showed Lisa and me smiling at the camera with expressions of happiness and optimism that now seemed impossibly naive. I walked into my home office and sat down at the desk where I usually reviewed client training plans and updated my continuing education certifications, and I opened my laptop and navigated to the online portal for our shared credit card account because I wanted to review the full transaction history and see if there were other charges that might indicate whether today's hotel visit was an isolated incident or part of a longer pattern that I had somehow failed to notice. The banking interface loaded slowly, as though the universe was giving me one last chance to reconsider whether I really wanted to see whatever information was about to appear on the screen, and then the transaction list populated with several months of purchases and payments that represented the ordinary financial activities of a married couple managing their household expenses and discretionary spending. I scrolled through the recent charges looking for anything that seemed unusual or inconsistent with what I knew about Lisa's typical routines and spending patterns, and I found that most of the entries were exactly what I would have expected to see, including grocery store purchases and gas station charges and restaurant meals and online shopping orders that Lisa had mentioned receiving over the past few weeks. But as I continued scrolling backward through March and into late February, I noticed a pattern that made my stomach tighten with recognition, because there were 3 additional charges to the Hilton Hotel spaced roughly 2 weeks apart, and each charge was in the range of $70 to $90, which suggested room rates rather than restaurant or bar tabs. The first Hilton charge had been posted on February 20th, which was a Tuesday afternoon, and I remembered that Lisa had told me she was meeting with a potential client that day to discuss a social media strategy proposal. The second charge appeared on March 6th, which had been a Wednesday, and I recalled that Lisa had said she was attending a professional development workshop for marketing consultants that was being held at a downtown conference center. The third charge was dated March 20th, which was exactly 2 weeks before today's encounter, and I was fairly certain that Lisa had told me she was having lunch with her sister that day, although I would need to verify that timeline to be completely sure. I took screenshots of all 4 Hilton charges and saved them to a folder on my desktop, and then I opened a new document and began creating a simple timeline that listed the dates and the cover stories that Lisa had provided for each occasion when she had apparently been at the hotel instead of where she claimed to be. The act of organizing the information into a structured format helped me maintain the analytical mindset that I needed to process what I was discovering without allowing my emotions to overwhelm my ability to think clearly about what steps I should take next. As I was working on the timeline, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, and I glanced at the clock on my computer screen and noted that it was approximately 6 o'clock, which meant that Lisa had spent the past hour and a half either sitting somewhere processing what had happened at the hotel, or perhaps meeting with Derek again to coordinate their stories and decide how they were going to handle my unexpected discovery of their affair. I saved my timeline document and closed my laptop, and then I walked out to the living room and waited for Lisa to come through the front door with whatever explanation she had prepared during her drive home. Lisa entered the house carrying her purse and her work bag, and she had apparently decided to act as though this was a normal evening and nothing particularly unusual had occurred, because she set her bags down on the kitchen counter and asked me how my day had been. In the same casual tone she used on any ordinary Thursday when we were both home from work and settling into our evening routine. I observed her performance with the same detached curiosity I might bring to watching a client attempt an exercise with completely incorrect form, and I waited to see how long she would maintain the pretense before acknowledging what had actually happened this afternoon. Lisa moved around the kitchen opening cabinets and pulling out ingredients as though she was planning to prepare dinner, and she kept up a stream of cheerful conversation about various mundane topics, including a funny video she had seen on social media and a sale that was happening at her favorite clothing store, and a question about whether we needed to buy more paper towels because she thought we were running low. I let her talk without interrupting, and I remained standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room with my arms crossed and my expression neutral. And eventually Lisa seemed to register that I was not responding to her attempts at normal conversation and that something was going to have to be addressed directly. Lisa stopped what she was doing and turned to face me, and she asked in a voice that was carefully modulated to sound both innocent and slightly wounded why I was acting strange and whether I was upset about something that had happened. I told Lisa that I thought we should talk about this afternoon and about the fact that she had been at the Hilton with Derek Hale when she had told me she was going to be at her cousin Julia's baby shower, and I said that I was interested in hearing her explanation for why those two things did not match up. Lisa's expression shifted from manufactured innocence to something more calculating, and I could see her making rapid decisions about what approach would be most effective in managing the situation and minimizing the damage to her position. She launched into the explanation that she and Derek had apparently agreed upon during their time after I left the hotel, and she told me that she had indeed gone to Julia's baby shower earlier in the afternoon, but that she had left early because Derek had called her with an urgent request to meet and review some marketing materials that needed to be finalized by the end of the week for a campaign they were planning. Lisa explained that she had suggested they meet at the Hilton because it was roughly halfway between the restaurant where the baby shower was being held and the gym where Derek worked, and she said that Derek had offered to pay for a conference room rental so they would have a quiet private space to spread out the materials and work without interruptions or distractions. She claimed that when they arrived at the hotel, the business center was fully booked, so Derek had suggested they rent a regular room instead, which would give them the same privacy and workspace, and Lisa said she had paid for the room with our credit card because Derek had apparently left his wallet in his car and had offered to reimburse her later. I listened to Lisa's explanation without interrupting, and when she finished speaking, I asked her why she had not mentioned this morning that she was planning to leave Julia's baby shower early to meet with Derek for a work session. Lisa said that the meeting had come up unexpectedly after I had already left for the gym, and that she had not thought to text me about the change in plans because it seemed like a minor adjustment to her schedule that did not really affect me or require my input or approval. I asked Lisa why she had been carrying a coffee cup from the hotel room when I saw her in the lobby if she and Derek had been working in the business center as she had originally claimed, before revising her story to say they had been in a rented room. Lisa stumbled slightly over her response and said that she had misspoken earlier and that yes, they had been in a room on the upper floors and had used the in-room coffee service during their work session, and she seemed annoyed that I was focusing on these kinds of specific details rather than accepting the general outline of her explanation. I asked Lisa if she could describe what the baby shower had been like before she left early to meet Derek, and Lisa immediately began providing details about the decorations and the food and the games that had been played and the other guests who had been in attendance. She told me that the restaurant had been decorated with pink and white balloons because Julia was having a girl, and that there had been a beautiful cake with elaborate frosting designs, and that Julia's mother had organized a game where guests had to guess the baby's birth date and weight. I let Lisa continue describing the baby shower for several minutes, and when she finally paused, I asked her what gift she had brought for Julia and the baby. Lisa's eyes flickered with something that might have been uncertainty or calculation, and she said that she had brought a set of organic cotton baby clothes from a boutique store that specialized in environmentally friendly children's products, and she described the outfit in detail, including the colors and the cute animal designs that had been embroidered on the pieces. I told Lisa that her description was very convincing and that I appreciated the level of detail she had put into her story, and then I asked her if she would mind stepping outside with me for a moment because I wanted to check something in her car. Lisa looked confused, but followed me out to the driveway where her silver SUV was parked in its usual spot, and I walked to the rear of the vehicle and stood beside the trunk waiting for Lisa to open it with her key fob. Lisa hesitated for a moment as though she was trying to understand where I was going with this request, and then she pressed the button to release the trunk latch, and the door lifted automatically to reveal the interior storage space. Inside the trunk was a neatly wrapped gift bag with pink tissue paper sticking out of the top, and attached to the bag was a card that was still in its sealed envelope with Julia's name written on the front in Lisa's handwriting. I gestured toward the gift and asked Lisa why the baby shower present she had supposedly given to Julia earlier this afternoon was still sitting unopened in her car trunk. Lisa stared at the gift bag as though it was a piece of evidence in a crime scene that she had not expected to encounter, and I watched her face as she tried to formulate some kind of explanation that would account for this obvious contradiction in her story about attending the baby shower. Lisa started to say something about how she must have forgotten to take the gift into the restaurant when she arrived at the baby shower, and then she stopped and seemed to recognize that this excuse would require her to explain why Julia had not called or texted to ask about the missing gift or to thank her for attending the party. Lisa closed the trunk without saying anything else, and we walked back into the house in silence while I waited to see what approach she would try next. Once we were back inside, Lisa switched tactics entirely, and instead of continuing to defend her baby shower story, she pivoted to a position of righteous indignation about the fact that I had apparently been tracking her movements and checking up on her activities like some kind of jealous, controlling husband who did not trust his wife to manage her own schedule. She demanded to know how I had known she was at the Hilton in the first place, and she accused me of following her or spying on her in ways that she characterized as invasive and inappropriate and possibly even illegal, depending on what methods I had used to gather information about her whereabouts. I told Lisa that I had received an anonymous text message that informed me of her location at the hotel, and that I had simply verified the information by checking our shared credit card account, which I had every right to access as a joint account holder. Lisa demanded to see the text message, and when I showed her my phone with the unknown number and the 8-word message, she stared at it for a long moment, and then asked if I had any idea who might have sent it. I told Lisa that I did not know who had sent the message, but that I was very interested in finding out, because whoever it was clearly had detailed knowledge of her activities and had decided for reasons of their own that I should be informed about what was happening. Lisa and I spent the next hour in an increasingly tense conversation that circled around the same fundamental issues without ever arriving at any kind of resolution or acknowledgement of the truth that we both knew was sitting between us like a physical object that neither of us wanted to touch directly. Lisa had apparently decided that her best strategy was to maintain her story about the work meeting with Derek, while simultaneously attacking my decision to verify her location at the hotel, and she kept returning to the question of who had sent the anonymous text message and what their motivations might have been for inserting themselves into our marriage and creating suspicion where none had previously existed. I noticed that Lisa was very careful never to directly admit that she had been having an affair with Derek or that anything inappropriate had occurred in the hotel room, and instead she kept framing the situation as a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion by my suspicious reaction to what was actually a perfectly innocent professional meeting that just happened to take place in a hotel room because of logistical convenience. She pointed out that Derek was a business partner at the gym where she had her membership and where I worked, and that it was perfectly natural for her to have professional interactions with him regarding marketing consultation work that could benefit the gym's social media presence and member recruitment efforts. I asked Lisa why she had felt it necessary to lie about attending Julia's baby shower if the meeting with Derek was as innocent as she claimed, and Lisa responded by saying that she had not technically lied because she had fully intended to attend the baby shower but had been forced to change her plans when Derek called with the urgent work request, and that she simply had not gotten around to updating me about the schedule modification because everything had happened so quickly. I pointed out that she had also lied just now about attending the baby shower and bringing a gift and participating in games and seeing decorations, and that those were not schedule modifications but rather deliberate fabrications designed to conceal where she had actually been spending her afternoon. Lisa's face flushed red, and her voice became louder as she told me that I was twisting her words and making everything sound much worse than it actually was, and that I was being unreasonable and controlling and exactly the kind of husband who drove his wife away by refusing to give her any independence or trust. She said that the fact that I had immediately jumped to conclusions about an affair rather than accepting her explanation about a work meeting showed that I had fundamental problems with jealousy and insecurity that we would need to address through counseling if our marriage was going to survive. I let Lisa finish her speech without responding, and then I told her that I needed some time alone to think about everything that had happened today, and that I was going to go for a drive, and that she should not expect me back for several hours. Lisa looked surprised by this announcement and started to protest that we needed to keep talking and work through the situation together, but I was already walking toward the door with my car keys in my hand, and I did not stop to engage with her attempts to continue the conversation. I drove aimlessly for about 20 minutes without any particular destination in mind, and eventually I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a coffee shop that was located in a strip mall about 2 miles from our house in a direction that I rarely traveled because there were no gyms or grocery stores or other regular stops that would normally bring me to this part of the neighborhood. I went inside and ordered a black coffee that I did not particularly want, but that gave me a reason to sit at one of the small tables near the window and stare out at the parking lot while I tried to process the events of the afternoon and decide what I should do next. While I was sitting at the coffee shop, my phone buzzed with a new text message, and when I looked at the screen, I saw that it was from the same unknown number that had sent me the original message about Lisa being at the Hilton. This new message contained only 7 words, and those words were, "Ask her about the other 3 times." I stared at the message for several seconds, trying to understand what it meant and what the sender was trying to tell me, and then I realized that the phrase "other 3 times" was probably referring to the additional Hilton charges I had found when I reviewed our credit card history earlier this evening. I typed a response message asking who I was communicating with and why they were sending me this information, but the text would not go through, and instead I received an automated error message indicating that the number I was trying to reach was not currently accepting incoming messages. This told me that whoever was on the other end had either blocked my number or was using some kind of temporary messaging service that only allowed outbound communication, and that they had no intention of engaging in a two-way conversation or revealing their identity at this stage. I sat in the coffee shop for another hour considering the implications of this second anonymous message and trying to identify who might have sufficient knowledge of Lisa's activities to know about multiple hotel visits, and who might also have reasons to want me to discover the affair. The most obvious candidates were other gym members or staff who might have witnessed interactions between Lisa and Derek that suggested something more than a professional relationship, or perhaps someone who worked at the Hilton and had noticed the pattern of visits and had decided for whatever reason that I deserved to know what was happening. I decided that I needed to go to the gym and see if I could identify any staff members who might have sent the messages, and I particularly wanted to talk to Tanya Brecken, who worked at the front desk and who I had always found to be observant and aware of the social dynamics among members and trainers in ways that suggested she paid close attention to what was happening around her. I knew that Tanya often worked late shifts that extended until 9 or 10 in the evening when the gym closed, and I checked the time on my phone and saw that it was now almost 8 o'clock, which meant that if I drove to the gym immediately, I might be able to catch her before the end of her shift. I left the coffee shop and drove to Summit Peak Gym, and when I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed that there were still about 15 or 20 cars scattered across the spaces, which indicated that the evening workout crowd was winding down but had not yet completely dispersed. I used my staff key card to enter through the employee entrance rather than going through the main lobby where I might encounter members who would want to chat about their training progress or ask questions about scheduling their next sessions, and I walked directly to the front desk area where Tanya was standing behind the counter processing membership card scans for people who were leaving after completing their workouts. Tanya looked up when she saw me approaching, and I noticed that her expression changed from her usual professional smile to something more uncertain or possibly concerned, and she glanced around the lobby area as though checking to see if anyone was close enough to overhear whatever conversation we were about to have. I asked Tanya if she had a few minutes to talk privately, and she told me that her shift ended in about 10 minutes and that she would be happy to meet me at the coffee shop across the street from the gym after she finished closing down the front desk and locking up the equipment checkout area. I walked across the street to the coffee shop that Tanya had mentioned and found a table in the back corner where we would have some privacy from other customers, and I ordered another coffee that I also did not particularly want, but that gave me something to do with my hands while I waited. Tanya arrived approximately 15 minutes later, still wearing her gym staff polo shirt with the Summit Peak logo embroidered on the chest, and she sat down across from me with an expression that suggested she knew exactly why I had asked to speak with her and was prepared for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Before I could say anything, Tanya reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone, and she slid it across the table toward me so that I could see the screen, which was displaying a notes app with what appeared to be a draft text message. The message on the screen was identical to the first anonymous text I had received that afternoon, and when I looked up at Tanya, she nodded and said quietly that yes, she was the one who had sent me both messages and that she wanted to apologize for the method she had chosen, but that she had felt strongly that I needed to know what was happening. I asked Tanya how she knew about Lisa and Derek, and how long she had been aware that something inappropriate was going on between them, and Tanya explained that she had first noticed unusual interactions between them approximately 3 months ago, when Derek had started showing up at the gym more frequently than was typical for someone who was supposedly focused on the business and financial side of the operation rather than on daily facility management. Tanya said that she had observed Derek and Lisa having extended conversations in the gym's juice bar area and near the equipment storage room and in the parking lot after evening classes, and that their body language and the way they looked at each other had suggested a level of intimacy that went beyond what would be normal for casual acquaintances or even for a consultant and a client working together on a marketing project. Tanya told me that she had initially dismissed her observations as speculation or possibly misinterpretation of innocent, friendly interactions, but that her concerns had solidified when she happened to be driving past the Hilton one afternoon in late February and had seen Lisa and Derek entering the hotel together through the main entrance while appearing to be deliberately casual about their proximity to each other in a way that actually made them more noticeable rather than less. Tanya said that she had felt conflicted about whether she should say something to me or whether she should mind her own business and let me remain ignorant of the situation, and that she had ultimately decided to send the anonymous text messages because she believed I had a right to know what was happening even if learning the truth was going to be painful. I asked Tanya why she had mentioned the other 3 times in her second message, and Tanya explained that she had not personally witnessed 3 additional hotel visits, but that she had overheard conversations between Derek and Paul, in which Derek had made jokes or comments that suggested he had been meeting with a married gym member on a regular basis over the past several months. Tanya said that she had not initially connected these comments to Lisa specifically, but that once she had seen them together at the hotel in February, she had started paying more attention to their interactions at the gym and had become convinced that Lisa was the person Derek had been referring to in his conversations with Paul. I asked Tanya whether Paul was aware that Derek was having an affair with a gym member, and Tanya's expression became uncomfortable as she told me that yes, she believed Paul knew about Derek's behavior and had chosen not to address it, because Derek was an essential financial partner whose investment capital had enabled Paul to purchase the gym franchise in the first place. Tanya said that Paul had a pattern of protecting Derek and deflecting or dismissing concerns that staff members or members had raised about Derek's conduct, and that she had personally witnessed at least 2 occasions when female gym members had complained about Derek making inappropriate comments or crossing professional boundaries, and Paul had minimized their concerns by suggesting they had misunderstood Derek's intentions or were being overly sensitive. Tanya told me that there had been at least 3 other women over the past 18 months who she suspected had been targets of Derek's attention in ways that went beyond appropriate professional or social interactions, and that at least one of those women had quietly switched to a different gym without providing a clear explanation for why she was canceling her membership despite having been an active and enthusiastic participant in classes and training sessions. Tanya said that she had felt increasingly guilty about her silence as she watched the pattern continue, and that when she saw me teaching spin classes and working with clients and maintaining the same calm, professional demeanor that everyone at the gym respected, she had realized that she could not keep protecting Derek's behavior by staying silent when I clearly had no idea what was happening behind my back. I thanked Tanya for her honesty and for having the courage to send me the text messages, even though doing so had put her in an uncomfortable position and had potentially exposed her to retaliation from Derek or Paul if they discovered that she was the source of the information that had led to my confrontation with Lisa at the hotel. Tanya told me that she was willing to provide a written statement documenting what she had observed regarding Derek's pattern of inappropriate relationships with married gym members, if such a statement would be useful to me in any legal or personal capacity, and she said that she had already begun keeping notes about specific dates and times when she had witnessed concerning interactions, because she had anticipated that eventually someone would need to hold Derek accountable for his behavior. I asked Tanya if she would be willing to describe in writing what she had seen and heard regarding Derek and Lisa specifically, and Tanya nodded and said that she could prepare a detailed account that would include the approximate dates when she first noticed their interactions becoming inappropriate, the February afternoon when she saw them entering the Hilton together, and the various conversations she had overheard in which Derek had made references to his relationship with a married gym member that she now believed was Lisa. Tanya also offered to document her knowledge of the other women who had been targets of Derek's attention, and she said that while she could not force those women to come forward publicly, she thought that establishing a pattern of behavior would be important if I decided to take any formal action against Derek, or if I needed to demonstrate to Lisa that her affair was not a special connection, but rather part of Derek's systematic approach to exploiting his position at the gym. I told Tanya that I would very much appreciate her written statement, and that I thought documenting Derek's pattern was important, not just for my personal situation, but also for protecting other gym members from becoming his future targets. And Tanya said she would prepare the statement over the weekend and would provide it to me early next week. We exchanged phone numbers so that we could communicate directly rather than through anonymous messages, and Tanya made me promise that I would be careful about how I used the information she was providing, because she was concerned that if Derek or Paul discovered she had been documenting their conversations and activities, they would find some pretext to terminate her employment and would make it difficult for her to find work at other gyms in the area where Paul had connections and influence. I left the coffee shop feeling both grateful for Tanya's intervention and overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation that was now unfolding around me, because what had started as a simple discovery of my wife's infidelity was beginning to reveal itself as part of a larger pattern involving institutional failures and protected predatory behavior that extended far beyond my personal marriage. I drove home through the dark streets of the suburban neighborhood where Lisa and I had built what I thought was a stable life together, and I found myself looking at the houses I passed with their lit windows and their neat lawns and their cars parked in driveways, and wondering how many of those homes contained similar secrets and deceptions that were being maintained through careful lies and strategic silences. When I arrived home, I found that Lisa had apparently decided to go to bed rather than wait up for me to return, and I could see light coming from under the closed bedroom door, which suggested she was still awake, but had chosen to retreat into private space rather than continuing our earlier confrontation. I went into my home office and sat down at my desk, and I opened my laptop and created a new document where I began writing a detailed chronological account of everything that had happened starting from the moment I received the first anonymous text message at 4:47 that afternoon. I documented the exact wording of both text messages, the timestamps on the credit card charges from the Hilton, the photographs I had taken of the valet ticket on Lisa's windshield, the conversation in the hotel lobby where I had confronted Lisa and Derek, and the subsequent discussion at home where Lisa had attempted to maintain her cover story about attending Julia's baby shower before the evidence of the unopened gift in her trunk had forced her to abandon that particular fabrication. I also included detailed notes from my conversation with Tanya, including her account of witnessing Lisa and Derek together at the Hilton in February, and her observations about Derek's pattern of targeting married gym members over an extended period. The act of writing everything down helped me process the information in a structured way and also created a contemporaneous record that might be useful if I eventually needed to demonstrate to an attorney or a mediator, or even to Lisa's family, what had actually happened and what evidence I had gathered to support my conclusions. I spent approximately 2 hours working on the document, and by the time I finished, it was nearly midnight, and I was exhausted both physically and emotionally from the intensity of the day's events and revelations. I did not want to sleep in the bedroom with Lisa given everything that had happened, so I gathered a pillow and a blanket from the linen closet and made myself as comfortable as possible on the living room couch. And I lay in the darkness, thinking about the anonymous text message and about how my life had been completely transformed in the space of less than 8 hours by information that someone else had chosen to share with me. I wondered what my marriage would look like now, and whether there was any possibility of rebuilding trust with someone who had demonstrated such a sustained capacity for deception, and I thought about the practical considerations of separation and divorce and how we would divide our shared property and our shared financial accounts and all the accumulated possessions and commitments that represented 7 years of building a life together. I must have eventually fallen asleep because I woke suddenly to the sound of Lisa moving around in the kitchen, and when I checked my phone, I saw that it was almost 7 in the morning, which meant I had slept for approximately 6 hours despite my expectation that I would spend most of the night lying awake replaying the events of the previous day. I remained on the couch for several minutes listening to the familiar sounds of Lisa making coffee and opening cabinet doors, and I tried to decide whether I should get up and attempt to have another conversation with her or whether I should simply continue avoiding direct interaction until I had more clarity about what I wanted to say and what outcomes I was hoping to achieve. Lisa appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room holding a mug of coffee, and she looked at me lying on the couch with the rumpled blanket and the pillow that had fallen onto the floor during the night, and she asked in a voice that was carefully neutral whether I had been comfortable sleeping out here or whether I might want to discuss returning to our normal sleeping arrangements. I told Lisa that I thought it would be better for both of us if we maintained separate sleeping spaces for the time being, and that I was planning to use the couch or possibly the guest room at my parents' house until we had worked through at least some of the issues that needed to be addressed before we could resume any kind of normal domestic routine. Lisa set her coffee mug down on the side table and sat in the armchair across from the couch, and she told me that she had been awake most of the night thinking about our conversation and about how we had reached this point of crisis in our marriage. She said that she wanted to be completely honest with me about what had been happening with Derek, and that she realized now that her attempts to maintain the fiction about work meetings and schedule changes had only made the situation worse and had damaged whatever trust might still exist between us. Lisa explained that her relationship with Derek had begun approximately 4 months ago, when he had approached her at the gym and had complimented her on her fitness progress and had asked whether she would be interested in discussing marketing consultation opportunities that might help the gym improve its social media presence and member engagement strategies. Lisa said that she had been flattered by Derek's attention and by his apparent recognition of her professional skills, and that their initial conversations had genuinely focused on business topics and marketing strategies, even though she now recognized that Derek had been using those professional discussions as a way to establish regular contact and build rapport before gradually introducing more personal topics into their interactions. Lisa told me that the shift from professional consultation to personal intimacy had happened gradually over several weeks as Derek began sharing details about his own life and his relationship with his wife, Claire, and his feelings of being unappreciated and undervalued in his marriage despite his financial contributions and his efforts to build a successful business partnership with Paul. Lisa said that Derek had seemed to understand her in ways that I apparently did not, and that he had expressed a genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions about topics beyond just fitness and household management, and that she had found herself looking forward to their conversations at the gym and seeking out opportunities to extend those conversations beyond the brief exchanges that would normally occur between acquaintances in a shared public space. I listened to Lisa describe the development of her emotional connection with Derek without interrupting, and I noticed that she was being careful to frame the affair as something that had evolved organically from mutual understanding and emotional compatibility rather than as a deliberate choice to betray our marriage vows or to engage in deceptive behavior. She acknowledged that the relationship had become physical approximately 2 months ago when Derek had suggested they meet at the Hilton to continue a conversation they had been having at the gym about her career aspirations and her feeling that she was not living up to her professional potential, and Lisa said that she had not intended for the meeting to become anything more than an extended conversation, but that Derek had created an atmosphere of intimacy and validation that had made it easy for her to cross boundaries that she had previously considered absolute. Lisa told me that she understood now that Derek had been manipulating her emotions and exploiting her vulnerabilities in ways that she had not recognized at the time, and that learning from Tanya's observations about Derek's pattern with other married gym members had helped her understand that she was not special or uniquely understood, but was rather one of several women who had been targeted using similar tactics. She said that this realization had been humiliating and had forced her to reconsider whether her relationship with Derek had been based on genuine connection or whether she had simply been another conquest in a pattern of predatory behavior that Paul and the gym management had enabled by refusing to establish or enforce appropriate professional boundaries. I asked Lisa why she had continued the affair for 4 months if she now claimed to recognize that Derek had been manipulating her, and I pointed out that the timeline she was describing suggested numerous opportunities to end the relationship or to confess to me what was happening before the situation reached the point where I had discovered them together at the hotel. Lisa became defensive and said that I was making it sound simpler than it actually was, and that leaving an affair was psychologically complicated, especially when the other person was skilled at creating emotional dependency and at reinforcing the narrative that the affair was justified by problems in the primary relationship. Lisa also told me that she had been genuinely unhappy in our marriage for longer than just the 4 months of her affair with Derek, and that she had felt increasingly isolated and invisible as I devoted more energy to my work at the gym and to my fitness clients than to maintaining our emotional connection and making her feel valued as a partner, rather than just as a person who shared my living space and my household responsibilities. She said that she had tried multiple times over the past year to initiate conversations about her feelings of loneliness and disconnection, and that I had typically responded by suggesting she find activities or hobbies that would give her a sense of purpose without requiring me to make significant changes to my own schedule or priorities. I told Lisa that while I was willing to acknowledge that our marriage may have had problems that neither of us had addressed effectively, I did not accept the premise that her unhappiness justified conducting a sustained affair that involved systematic deception and the misuse of our shared financial resources to pay for hotel rooms where she could meet her lover. I explained that if she had been genuinely unhappy and had felt that I was not responsive to her emotional needs, then the appropriate course of action would have been to insist on couples counseling or to have a serious conversation about separation rather than choosing to betray our marriage vows while maintaining the appearance of normalcy and commitment. Lisa responded by saying that I was being rigid and judgmental and that I was failing to understand the psychological complexity of how people actually behave when they are struggling in their marriages, and she suggested that my military background and my analytical approach to problem solving made me incapable of understanding emotional situations that did not fit into neat categories of right and wrong. She said that real life was messier than the clear moral frameworks I seemed to prefer, and that most people who had affairs did not set out with the intention of betraying their spouses, but rather found themselves in situations where one small compromise led to another until they were deeply involved in relationships they had never planned to have. I asked Lisa whether she was planning to continue her relationship with Derek now that I knew about the affair, and Lisa looked surprised by the question, as though she had not considered what would happen next, beyond managing the immediate crisis of having been discovered. She told me that she had not spoken to Derek since yesterday afternoon when I had confronted them in the hotel lobby, and that she assumed Derek would probably want to distance himself from the situation now that there was a risk of his behavior becoming known to Paul or to other people at the gym, who might judge him negatively or create problems for his business partnership. I told Lisa that she was probably correct about Derek's likely response, because men like him typically lost interest in their targets once the affair stopped being easy and convenient and started creating complications that threatened their comfortable lives, and I said that I suspected Derek had probably already begun constructing a narrative that would minimize his responsibility and cast Lisa as the aggressor who had pursued him rather than the other way around. Lisa's face flushed with anger, and she told me that I had no right to make assumptions about Derek's character or his feelings toward her, and that just because I had discovered the affair did not mean that I understood the depth or the nature of their connection. I decided that continuing this particular line of conversation was not productive, so I changed topics and asked Lisa what she thought we should do about our living arrangements and our marriage going forward. Lisa said that she wanted to try to work through the situation and rebuild our relationship if I was willing to give her a chance to earn back my trust, and she suggested that we should find a marriage counselor who could help us communicate more effectively and address the underlying issues that had created vulnerability in our relationship. I told Lisa that I appreciated her willingness to consider counseling, but that I needed some time to think about whether I believed our marriage was salvageable, and that my immediate priority was to gather complete information about the scope of her affair and the extent of her deception before making any decisions about reconciliation. Lisa asked me what I meant by gathering complete information, and I told her that I wanted her to provide me with a full accounting of every time she had met with Derek over the past 4 months, including dates and locations and what had occurred during each encounter. Lisa looked uncomfortable with this request and said that she did not think it would be healthy or productive for either of us if I insisted on knowing every specific detail of her affair, and that focusing on the particulars would only create more pain without providing any useful insight into how we could move forward. I explained that I needed the complete timeline because without it, I would always wonder whether she was still hiding parts of the story, and that the only way I could begin to consider rebuilding trust was if she demonstrated a commitment to complete transparency rather than selective disclosure of only the information that I had already discovered through other means. Lisa reluctantly agreed to write out a timeline of her relationship with Derek, and she said she would provide it to me by the end of the weekend if I promised that I would read it in private rather than using the information as ammunition during arguments or as justification for punishing her indefinitely for her mistakes. I told Lisa that I could not promise how I would react to whatever information she provided because I did not yet know what that information would reveal, but that I would try to approach her timeline with the same analytical mindset I brought to other difficult situations rather than allowing my emotional responses to override my ability to think clearly about what steps needed to be taken next. I left the house shortly after this conversation because I did not want to spend the weekend in close proximity to Lisa while we were both processing the emotional aftermath of the past 2 days, and I drove to my parents' house, which was located about 40 minutes away in the same small town where I had grown up before joining the military and eventually settling in the suburban area where Lisa and I had purchased our home. My parents were both retired and spent most of their time gardening and volunteering at their church and babysitting for my younger sister's children, and when I arrived unannounced on their doorstep on a Saturday morning, they immediately understood from my expression that something serious had happened. I spent the next several hours sitting in my parents' kitchen telling them about Lisa's affair and about the anonymous text messages from Tanya, and about my confrontation with Lisa and Derek at the hotel lobby, and my mother listened with increasing expressions of shock and concern, while my father maintained the same stoic demeanor that he had displayed throughout my childhood whenever I came to him with problems that required practical solutions rather than emotional reassurance. When I finished explaining the situation, my mother asked me whether I thought there was any possibility of saving my marriage through counseling and renewed commitment, and I told her honestly that I did not know because I was still trying to understand how someone I had trusted completely for 7 years could have maintained such an elaborate system of lies without my noticing any clear warning signs. My father asked me whether I had consulted with an attorney yet about my legal options regarding separation and divorce, and when I told him that I had not taken that step yet because I was still gathering information about the full scope of Lisa's affair, he suggested that I should meet with a lawyer as soon as possible even if I ultimately decided not to pursue a divorce. He explained that understanding my legal rights and options would help me make more informed decisions about how to proceed, and that having an attorney review our financial accounts and property ownership arrangements would be important for protecting my interests regardless of whether Lisa and I eventually chose to reconcile or to separate permanently. I took my father's advice seriously because his practical approach to problem solving had always served him well in his own career as an engineer, and on Monday morning I called a divorce attorney, whose name I had found through an online search of highly rated family law practitioners in the area. The attorney's name was Richard Walsh, and his office was located in a professional building near the courthouse, and when I explained over the phone that I needed a consultation regarding a separation from my wife due to infidelity, Richard's assistant scheduled an appointment for me that same afternoon at 2 o'clock. I arrived at Richard's office 15 minutes early and spent the waiting time reviewing the documentation I had prepared over the weekend, which included printouts of the credit card charges from the Hilton, photographs of the valet ticket from Lisa's car, screenshots of the anonymous text messages from Tanya, and the detailed chronological narrative I had written describing the discovery of the affair and my subsequent conversations with Lisa and Tanya. Richard called me into his office at precisely 2 o'clock, and I noticed that he had the efficient demeanor of someone who had handled hundreds of similar cases, and who understood that clients in my situation needed clear practical guidance rather than sympathy or emotional support. Richard reviewed all of my documentation carefully and asked detailed questions about the timeline of events and about Lisa's admissions regarding her relationship with Derek, and then he explained that in our state, infidelity was not technically grounds for fault-based divorce, but that documented evidence of an affair could be relevant in negotiations regarding property division and spousal support if Lisa attempted to claim that she deserved a larger share of our assets or ongoing financial support after separation. Richard also explained that because Lisa had used our joint credit card to pay for hotel rooms where she conducted her affair, I had a strong argument that she had misappropriated marital funds for personal purposes, and that this could be factored into the eventual settlement calculations. I asked Richard whether he thought I should file for separation immediately, or whether I should wait to see if Lisa provided the complete timeline she had promised, and whether that information might change my assessment of the situation. Richard told me that the decision about timing was ultimately mine to make based on my personal tolerance for continued cohabitation with Lisa and my willingness to explore potential reconciliation, but that from a purely strategic legal perspective, there were advantages to filing sooner rather than later because it would establish a clear date of separation that would affect how subsequent earnings and asset acquisitions were classified for property division purposes. Richard also told me that he had handled several cases involving affairs that occurred within gym or fitness center environments, and that in his experience, these situations often involved what he called institutional enabling, where gym owners or managers were aware of inappropriate relationships between staff members or business partners and gym members, but chose not to intervene because they prioritized business relationships over the safety and well-being of their membership base. Richard asked me whether I had considered taking any action against Derek or against the gym ownership for allowing Derek's predatory pattern to continue, and I told him about Tanya's observations regarding Derek's targeting of multiple married gym members and Paul's apparent knowledge of and indifference to this pattern. Richard explained that while it would be difficult to pursue a successful lawsuit against the gym for Derek's personal misconduct, there might be other mechanisms for holding Derek accountable that would be more effective and more satisfying than traditional litigation. He told me that most gym franchises operated under licensing agreements that included morality clauses and conduct standards for business partners and key personnel, and that if I could document Derek's pattern of inappropriate relationships with gym members, it might be possible to file a complaint with the state franchise licensing board that could result in sanctions or even revocation of Derek's ability to maintain his partnership stake in the gym. I asked Richard how I would go about accessing the gym's franchise agreement to determine whether such a morality clause existed, and Richard suggested that as an employee of the gym, I might have legitimate access to certain business documents that were kept on file at the facility, or that I could potentially request copies of licensing and partnership documents through a formal discovery process if we decided to pursue a complaint with the state board. Richard also suggested that I should ask Tanya whether she would be willing to provide her written statement, not just to me personally, but also as part of a formal complaint filing, and that if other women who had been targeted by Derek could be convinced to come forward even with anonymous statements, the cumulative evidence of a pattern would be much more compelling than a single allegation based solely on my wife's affair. I left Richard's office feeling somewhat more clear about my options and about the strategic steps I could take to protect myself legally and financially while also potentially creating consequences for Derek that would extend beyond just the personal embarrassment of having his affair exposed. I realized that what had started as a devastating discovery about my wife's betrayal was transforming into something larger that involved questions of institutional accountability and the protection of vulnerable people who were being exploited by someone in a position of trust and authority. I returned home that evening to find Lisa sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open in front of her and several printed pages spread across the surface, and when she looked up at me, her expression was a mixture of resignation and defiance that suggested she had completed the timeline I had requested, but was not particularly happy about having been forced to document the details of her affair in writing. Lisa told me that she had spent most of the day working on the account I had asked for, and that she had tried to be as honest and complete as possible, even though revisiting all of the specific encounters and conversations had been emotionally difficult, and had forced her to confront aspects of her behavior that she had been able to avoid examining while the affair was ongoing. I sat down across from Lisa at the kitchen table, and she slid the printed pages toward me without saying anything further, and I could see that she had organized the information chronologically with dates and locations and brief descriptions of what had occurred during each meeting with Derek. I began reading through the timeline while Lisa sat watching me with an expression that seemed to be waiting for some kind of reaction or judgment, and as I absorbed the information on the pages in front of me, I felt a cold recognition settling over me that was somehow worse than the initial shock of discovering the affair, because now I was seeing the full scope of how many separate occasions Lisa had chosen to lie to me and how elaborate her system of cover stories and schedule manipulations had been. According to Lisa's written account, the affair had begun in late December, when Derek had first approached her at the gym with what he framed as a business opportunity to help develop marketing strategies for attracting new members, and their initial meetings had taken place at coffee shops and restaurants, where they discussed social media tactics and content creation approaches that Derek claimed would help differentiate Summit Peak Gym from competing fitness facilities in the area. Lisa wrote that these early meetings had felt genuinely professional and that she had not interpreted Derek's attention as romantic or sexual interest, but rather as recognition of her expertise and her potential value as a consultant who could help the gym expand its market presence. The timeline indicated that the first hotel meeting had occurred on February 20th, which matched the earliest Hilton charge I had found in our credit card records, and Lisa explained in her written account that Derek had suggested they meet at the hotel because he needed a private quiet space to review marketing materials without the distractions and interruptions that were constant at the gym facility. Lisa wrote that she had not questioned this explanation at the time because it had seemed reasonable and because Derek had maintained a professional demeanor during the meeting. Even though in retrospect she could see that he had been carefully testing boundaries and creating a context where future intimacy would feel like a natural progression rather than a dramatic departure from their established pattern. The timeline showed that there had been 5 additional hotel meetings between February 20th and the day I had confronted them in the lobby, which meant that Lisa had been more frequent in her deceptions than even the credit card records had initially suggested, because apparently some of the meetings had been paid for in cash or on Derek's personal credit card rather than on our joint account. Lisa's written descriptions of these encounters were clinical and spare, providing just enough detail to establish what had occurred without including the kind of intimate specifics that would have been gratuitously painful for me to read. And I found myself oddly grateful for her restraint, even as I was processing the cumulative weight of 6 separate occasions when she had chosen to betray our marriage vows. What struck me most forcefully as I read through Lisa's timeline was not the sexual nature of the affair, but rather the elaborate infrastructure of lies that had been necessary to sustain it, because each hotel meeting had required Lisa to construct a plausible cover story about where she was going and what she was doing and who she was meeting, and then she had needed to maintain those cover stories through follow-up conversations where I might ask casual questions about how her day had gone or what she had accomplished during her various appointments and errands. The baby shower alibi that had ultimately led to her exposure was just one example in a long series of fabricated events and fictional commitments that Lisa had used to create blocks of time when her whereabouts would not be questioned or scrutinized. I finished reading the timeline and set the pages down on the table, and I looked at Lisa and asked her whether this written account represented the complete truth about her relationship with Derek, or whether there were additional meetings or encounters that she had chosen not to include because they seemed less significant, or because she was still trying to protect herself from the full consequences of her choices. Lisa told me with what sounded like genuine frustration that yes, the timeline was complete and accurate to the best of her memory, and that she had included everything she could remember about the affair, even though doing so had required her to acknowledge just how much time and energy and emotional investment she had devoted to a relationship that she now recognized had been based on manipulation and exploitation rather than on genuine connection. I asked Lisa what she expected would happen next, now that she had provided me with the complete timeline, and whether she had given any thought to how we were supposed to move forward as a married couple, given that I now knew she had lied to me systematically for 4 months, and had demonstrated a capacity for deception that made it difficult for me to trust anything she said about her feelings or her intentions. Lisa responded by saying that she understood I was angry and hurt, and that she did not expect me to forgive her immediately, or to simply accept her apology and move on as though nothing had happened, but that she hoped I would be willing to give her an opportunity to demonstrate through consistent, honest behavior over time that she was capable of being the kind of partner I deserved. I told Lisa that I appreciated her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and to commit to trying to rebuild trust, but that before I could seriously consider reconciliation, I needed to understand whether there would be any consequences for Derek beyond the personal discomfort of knowing that I was aware of his affair with my wife. Lisa looked confused by this statement and asked me what kind of consequences I thought Derek should face, and I explained that based on conversations I had been having with people who understood the gym industry and the franchise licensing system, it appeared that Derek's pattern of targeting married gym members might constitute a violation of professional conduct standards that could affect his ability to maintain his partnership position at Summit Peak Gym. Lisa's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like alarm, and she asked me whether I was planning to report Derek to some kind of licensing authority or business oversight board. And I told her that I was still gathering information and exploring my options, but that yes, I was considering filing a formal complaint that would document Derek's predatory behavior and would potentially create professional consequences that matched the personal damage he had caused through his systematic exploitation of vulnerable women. Lisa immediately became defensive and told me that taking action against Derek professionally seemed vindictive and disproportionate, and that destroying his business reputation would not repair our marriage or help us move forward in any constructive way. I pointed out to Lisa that she seemed more concerned about protecting Derek from consequences than about addressing the harm he had caused to our marriage and to the other women he had targeted using similar manipulation tactics, and I asked her whether she was still emotionally invested in Derek, despite her claims that she now recognized the affair had been a mistake. Lisa denied that she was trying to protect Derek and insisted that her concern was about me and about whether pursuing revenge against Derek would ultimately make me feel better or would simply consume my energy and attention in ways that would prevent me from healing and moving forward with my life. I told Lisa that I did not view holding Derek accountable as revenge, but rather as a form of justice that would protect other gym members from becoming his future victims, and that if she genuinely regretted her affair and wanted to demonstrate that she understood the broader implications of Derek's behavior, then she should be supporting my efforts to document his pattern and to ensure that he faced appropriate consequences. Lisa did not respond immediately to this point, and I could see that she was struggling with conflicting feelings about Derek and about her own role in the affair, and about what she owed to me versus what she might still feel obligated to protect regarding Derek's reputation and livelihood. The conversation ended without any clear resolution about what would happen next with our marriage or with my plans regarding Derek, and I told Lisa that I was going to spend the night at my parents' house again because I needed space to think. Without the constant tension of being in the same home where we had supposedly been building a life together while she was actively deceiving me about her activities and her relationship with another man. Lisa looked hurt by my decision to leave, but did not try to argue with me or to convince me to stay, and I gathered some additional clothes and toiletries and drove back to my parents' house, where I spent the evening reviewing Lisa's timeline and comparing it against the documentation I had already assembled regarding credit card charges and dates when Lisa had provided specific alibis that I could now identify as fabrications. On Tuesday morning, I returned to Summit Peak Gym for my regular shift teaching early morning spin classes, and I noticed immediately that the atmosphere among the staff members seemed different in ways that suggested word had spread about my confrontation with Lisa and Derek at the Hilton. Several of my fellow trainers gave me sympathetic looks or asked if I was doing okay without directly referencing what had happened, and I responded with brief neutral statements that confirmed I was dealing with some personal issues, but that I appreciated their concern and wanted to maintain my professional focus on serving my clients and teaching my scheduled classes. I was in the staff break room between my second and third classes of the morning when Paul Sinclair appeared in the doorway and asked if I had a few minutes to meet with him in his office to discuss what he described as an urgent personnel matter that required immediate attention. I followed Paul to his office, which was located in the administrative section of the gym facility, away from the workout areas and the locker rooms. And when Paul closed the door behind us, I noticed that Derek was already sitting in one of the chairs facing Paul's desk, with an expression that combined nervousness and hostility in ways that suggested he had been preparing his own narrative about what had occurred between him and Lisa, and what it meant for my position at the gym. Paul sat down behind his desk and launched into what sounded like a carefully prepared speech about how he understood that I was dealing with difficult personal circumstances involving my marriage, and that he wanted to make sure that whatever issues existed between Lisa and me did not create problems or disruptions within the gym environment, where professionalism and member comfort needed to remain the top priorities. Paul explained that he had received complaints from several gym members who had witnessed my confrontation with Lisa and Derek in the hotel lobby, and that these members were concerned about whether there would be ongoing tension or conflict that might make them uncomfortable when they came to the gym for their workouts. I asked Paul to clarify which gym members had supposedly complained about my behavior, and Paul responded by saying that he could not share specific names because the complaints had been submitted confidentially, but that the general concern was about whether I would be able to maintain appropriate professional boundaries with Derek given my personal feelings about his relationship with Lisa. I pointed out to Paul that I had not had any confrontation with Derek at the gym, and that the hotel lobby encounter he was referring to had taken place off gym property during non-work hours, and that therefore any complaints about my behavior should be directed to the Hilton management rather than to him as my employer. Paul's expression became less friendly and more authoritative, and he told me that regardless of where the encounter had taken place, the fact remained that multiple gym members now knew about personal conflicts between me and Derek, and that this knowledge created potential liability for the gym if I allowed my emotions to affect my professional interactions with members or with other staff. I told Paul that I found it interesting that he was framing this conversation as being about my potential inability to maintain professional boundaries, when the actual issue was Derek's documented pattern of conducting inappropriate relationships with married gym members in ways that clearly violated any reasonable standard of ethical conduct for someone in his position as a business partner with authority over gym operations and access to member information. Paul's expression hardened, and he asked me what I meant by documented pattern, and I explained that I had become aware through conversations with gym staff members that Derek had targeted multiple married women over the past 18 months using his position at the gym to initiate relationships that began as professional networking opportunities and then progressed into affairs that caused harm to the women involved and to their families. Derek leaned forward in his chair and said in a voice that was meant to sound confident, but came across as defensive that he had no idea what lies I had been listening to or which disgruntled staff members were spreading false rumors about him, but that he categorically denied ever behaving inappropriately with any gym member and that any relationships he had developed with members were purely professional and completely above board. I looked directly at Derek and asked him whether he was claiming that his relationship with my wife Lisa had been purely professional, and Derek hesitated for just a moment before responding that what had happened between him and Lisa was a private matter between consenting adults that had nothing to do with his professional conduct at the gym. I pointed out to Derek that he could not simultaneously claim that all of his relationships with gym members were professional and also argue that his affair with Lisa was a private matter between consenting adults, and that his contradictory statements within the space of 30 seconds suggested he was struggling to maintain a coherent narrative about his behavior. Paul interrupted this exchange by saying that he had not called me into his office to litigate the details of Derek's personal life or to allow me to make accusations that could expose the gym to defamation liability, and that the purpose of this meeting was simply to establish clear expectations that I would maintain professional conduct while at work regardless of whatever personal grievances I might have against Derek or against any other person associated with the gym. I told Paul that I understood his stated expectations, but that I had some questions about the gym's franchise agreement, and specifically about whether there were conduct standards or morality clauses that applied to business partners like Derek, who had financial stakes in the operation and who represented the gym brand to members and to the broader community. Paul's expression became guarded, and he asked me why I was interested in the franchise agreement, and I explained that as an employee I wanted to understand what professional standards I was being held to, and whether those same standards applied equally to all people who had positions of authority or influence within the gym's organizational structure. Paul told me that the franchise agreement was a confidential business document that was not available for general employee review, and that if I had specific concerns about workplace policies or conduct standards, I should submit them in writing through the normal human resources channels rather than trying to access legal documents that did not pertain to my role as a fitness instructor. I nodded and thanked Paul for clarifying the process, and then I stood up to leave because it was clear that this meeting was not going to result in any acknowledgement of Derek's problematic behavior or any recognition that the real professional boundary issue at the gym involved Derek's exploitation of his position rather than my emotional reaction to discovering that he had been having an affair with my wife. As I was walking toward the door, Derek spoke up and said that he hoped I understood that what had happened between him and Lisa was not something he had planned or pursued deliberately, and that Lisa had been dealing with significant unhappiness in our marriage and had found in Derek someone who listened to her and valued her perspective in ways that apparently I had failed to do. I turned back to face Derek and told him that I was fascinated by his ability to frame his predatory targeting of vulnerable married women as an act of compassionate listening, and that I looked forward to seeing how that narrative would hold up when it was examined in the context of his pattern with multiple gym members over an extended period. Derek's face flushed red, and he started to respond with what sounded like an angry denial, but Paul cut him off and told me that this meeting was concluded and that I should return to my scheduled duties, and should refrain from making inflammatory accusations that could not be substantiated with credible evidence. I left Paul's office and returned to the main gym floor where I taught my remaining morning classes, and I noticed throughout the rest of my shift that both Paul and Derek were avoiding any areas where they might encounter me and were apparently having their own conversations about how to manage the situation I had created by refusing to accept their preferred narrative that my personal problems with Lisa were separate from any legitimate concerns about Derek's conduct at the gym. After my shift ended, I drove directly to a print shop that offered document services and photocopying, and I used one of their public computers to search online for information about the franchise company that operated Summit Peak Gym and about the licensing requirements and conduct standards that governed fitness facility operations in our state. I discovered through my research that the franchise company had a publicly available code of conduct document that outlined expectations for all franchise partners and key personnel, and that this code included specific language about maintaining professional relationships with gym members and avoiding conflicts of interest that could compromise member trust or create liability for the franchise system. I printed several copies of the Code of Conduct document and also located contact information for the State Franchise Licensing Board that Richard Walsh had mentioned during my consultation at his office. And I learned that the board maintained an online complaint submission portal where individuals could report violations of franchise conduct standards and could request investigations of businesses that appeared to be operating in ways that compromised consumer protection or professional ethics. I spent approximately an hour at the print shop computer drafting a preliminary complaint letter that outlined Derek's pattern of targeting married gym members and that identified specific dates and circumstances that could be verified through witness statements and through documentation I had already assembled. I did not submit the complaint immediately because I wanted to wait until I had received Tanya's written statement that she had promised to provide by the end of the week, and I also wanted to determine whether there were other staff members or former gym members who might be willing to provide corroborating accounts that would strengthen the pattern evidence and would make it more difficult for Paul or Derek to dismiss the complaint as a personal vendetta motivated by my anger about Lisa's affair. I left the print shop with my printed documents and drove to a coffee shop where I sat reviewing the franchise code of conduct and highlighting the specific sections that seemed most relevant to Derek's behavior and most likely to trigger a formal investigation if they were brought to the attention of the licensing board. While I was sitting at the coffee shop, my phone rang with a call from a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, I found myself speaking with a woman who identified herself as Andrea Morrison, and who explained that Tanya Brecken had given her my contact information because Tanya thought I should know about Andrea's experience with Derek Hale approximately 14 months ago when Andrea had been an active gym member at Summit Peak. Andrea told me that she had been in a vulnerable emotional state following the death of her mother and had been using exercise as a way to manage her grief and her stress, and that Derek had approached her with expressions of sympathy and offers to provide guidance about fitness strategies that could help with emotional well-being during difficult life transitions. Andrea said that Derek's initial attention had felt supportive and genuine, and that she had appreciated having someone at the gym who seemed to understand what she was going through and who took time to check in with her about how she was coping with her loss. Andrea explained that over a period of several weeks, Derek had gradually shifted their conversations from grief support to more personal topics, including questions about her marriage and whether her husband was providing adequate emotional support during her mourning process, and that Derek had begun making comments that suggested her husband did not truly understand her or appreciate the depth of her sensitivity and her need for someone who could connect with her on a more profound level. Andrea told me that she had eventually recognized that Derek was using her grief as an opportunity to create emotional dependency and to position himself as the person who uniquely understood her in ways that her husband allegedly did not, and that when she had started to feel uncomfortable with the direction of their interactions, she had attempted to establish clearer boundaries by limiting their conversations to brief, polite exchanges rather than extended personal discussions. Andrea said that Derek had responded to her boundary setting by becoming cold and dismissive, and that she had felt so uncomfortable with the shift in his behavior that she had ultimately decided to cancel her gym membership and switch to a different fitness facility, even though Summit Peak had been conveniently located near her home and had offered classes and equipment that met her training needs. I asked Andrea whether she had reported Derek's behavior to Paul or to any other gym management personnel before canceling her membership, and Andrea explained that she had attempted to have a conversation with Paul about her concerns, but that Paul had responded by suggesting she had misinterpreted Derek's friendly concern as something more than it was intended to be, and that Paul had made her feel as though she was being overly sensitive or was creating drama where none existed. Andrea said that she had left that conversation feeling embarrassed and doubted herself about whether her instincts regarding Derek's intentions had been accurate, and that it was only later, when she learned through mutual acquaintances about other women who had similar experiences with Derek, that she realized her concerns had been valid, and that Paul's dismissal of her complaint had been a conscious choice to protect Derek rather than an innocent failure to recognize problematic behavior. I thanked Andrea for being willing to share her experience with me, and I asked her whether she would be willing to provide a written statement that documented the timeline of Derek's interactions with her and Paul's response when she attempted to report her concerns, and Andrea said that yes, she would be happy to prepare such a statement if it would help prevent other women from going through similar experiences. Andrea also told me that she was in contact with at least 2 other former gym members who had their own stories about inappropriate attention from Derek, and that while she could not promise these women would be willing to come forward publicly, she thought they might be willing to provide anonymous corroborating statements if they understood that doing so could contribute to holding Derek accountable through some kind of formal complaint process. I explained to Andrea that I was preparing to file a complaint with the State Franchise Licensing Board, and that I believed having multiple witness accounts would be essential for establishing that Derek's relationship with my wife Lisa was part of a systematic pattern rather than an isolated incident, and Andrea said she understood the strategy and would reach out to the other women she knew who had been affected by Derek's behavior. We exchanged email addresses so that Andrea could send me her written statement once she had completed it, and before we ended the call, Andrea told me that she was grateful someone was finally taking action to address Derek's predatory conduct, and that she hoped the licensing board would take the complaint seriously rather than dismissing it as a personal dispute between me and Derek regarding my wife's affair. After the call with Andrea concluded, I sat in the coffee shop feeling a renewed sense of purpose about the complaint I was preparing, because what had started as my personal discovery of Lisa's betrayal was revealing itself to be connected to a much larger pattern of exploitation that had affected multiple women and their families over an extended period, while Paul had actively protected Derek by dismissing complaints and creating an environment where women felt they would not be believed if they came forward. Over the next several days, I received written statements from both Tanya and Andrea documenting their observations and experiences with Derek, and I also received 2 additional anonymous statements from former gym members who Andrea had contacted and who were willing to provide accounts of their own uncomfortable interactions with Derek as long as their identities could be protected from public disclosure. I spent several evenings organizing all of this material into a comprehensive complaint packet that included a detailed cover letter explaining the pattern I had identified, a timeline showing multiple incidents across an 18-month period, copies of the witness statements with identifying information redacted where necessary, and relevant excerpts from the franchise code of conduct that I believed Derek's behavior had violated. I also included in the complaint packet the documentation I had assembled regarding Lisa's affair with Derek, including the credit card charges from the Hilton, the photographs of the valet ticket, and Lisa's own written timeline describing the progression of their relationship from initial contact through the hotel encounters where the affair had been consummated. I recognized that including this personal material might make the complaint appear to be motivated by revenge rather than by genuine concern about professional misconduct, but I also believed that having concrete, detailed evidence of at least one complete relationship would make it much more difficult for Derek or Paul to dismiss the anonymous accounts as vague allegations that could not be verified or substantiated. Before submitting the complaint to the State Franchise Licensing Board, I scheduled another meeting with Richard Walsh to review the packet and to get his assessment of whether the evidence I had assembled would be sufficient to trigger a formal investigation and whether there were any legal risks I should be aware of in terms of potential defamation claims or retaliation from Derek or Paul. Richard spent approximately an hour reviewing all of the materials I had prepared, and when he finished, he told me that the complaint was well documented and professionally presented, and that in his opinion, it clearly established a pattern of behavior that violated the franchise conduct standards and that justified board scrutiny of Derek's continued participation as a business partner at Summit Peak Gym. Richard also told me that while there was always some risk of Derek attempting to file a defamation lawsuit in response to the complaint, the fact that I had multiple corroborating witness statements and documentary evidence supporting my allegations would make such a lawsuit very difficult for Derek to win, and that most attorneys would advise Derek against pursuing defamation claims that would require him to undergo discovery and deposition testimony about his relationships with gym members. Richard explained that, in his experience, people like Derek, who had been operating with impunity for extended periods, often responded to exposure with bluster and threats, but rarely followed through with actual legal action, because doing so would create a public record of their behavior that would be far more damaging than simply accepting whatever consequences the licensing board imposed. I left Richard's office feeling confident about moving forward with the complaint submission, and that evening I used the state licensing board's online portal to upload my complete complaint packet along with all supporting documentation and witness statements. The portal generated an automated confirmation email indicating that my complaint had been received and assigned a case number, and that I should expect to hear from a board investigator within 2 to 3 weeks regarding next steps in the review process. The email also explained that the board would notify Summit Peak Gym and specifically Derek Hale about the complaint and would provide them with an opportunity to respond to the allegations before any formal findings or sanctions were determined. I felt a sense of relief after submitting the complaint because I had taken concrete action to address Derek's behavior rather than simply absorbing the personal damage of Lisa's affair and allowing Derek to continue operating without consequences or accountability. I also recognized that submitting the complaint would likely create immediate repercussions at the gym and would probably result in Paul and Derek attempting to retaliate against me through my employment. But I had already discussed this possibility with Richard, and we had agreed that any retaliation would only strengthen my position by demonstrating the kind of institutional protection that had enabled Derek's pattern to continue for so long. 2 days after I submitted the complaint, I received a call from Paul asking me to come to his office immediately for an urgent meeting, and when I arrived, I found that Derek was once again present along with someone I did not recognize who Paul introduced as the gym's corporate attorney. Paul informed me in a voice that was attempting to sound calm but was clearly strained that he had received notification from the State Franchise Licensing Board about a complaint that had been filed regarding Derek's conduct with gym members, and that the complaint appeared to have been submitted by me based on the case number and the description of allegations that the board had provided in their initial communication to the gym. Paul said that he was extremely disappointed that I had chosen to file what he characterized as false and defamatory allegations against Derek through an official regulatory channel rather than working through internal gym procedures to resolve whatever personal grievances I might have, stemming from my marital problems with Lisa. The corporate attorney added that the gym was taking the complaint very seriously, not because the allegations had any merit, but because the process of responding to a licensing board investigation would be expensive and time-consuming, and would potentially damage the gym's reputation, even if Derek was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. I told Paul and the attorney that I had filed the complaint because I believed Derek's pattern of targeting vulnerable married gym members constituted a clear violation of the franchise conduct standards, and because Paul had demonstrated through his dismissive response to previous complaints that he had no intention of addressing the problem through internal processes. I explained that my complaint was supported by multiple witness statements from current and former gym members and staff who had observed or experienced Derek's inappropriate behavior, and that the evidence I had submitted went far beyond my personal situation with Lisa and established a systematic pattern that had affected numerous women over an extended period. Derek responded angrily that the so-called witness statements I had submitted were nothing more than gossip and speculation from disgruntled former members who had their own reasons for wanting to damage his reputation, and that the licensing board would quickly recognize that my complaint was a transparent attempt to use regulatory processes as a weapon in a personal dispute about my failing marriage. The corporate attorney warned me that if the licensing board investigation resulted in any damage to the gym's franchise status or to Derek's business interests, the gym would pursue all available legal remedies against me, including claims for defamation and tortious interference with business relationships. I remained calm throughout this exchange and told Paul and the attorney that I welcomed the opportunity for the licensing board to conduct a thorough investigation because I was confident that such an investigation would reveal exactly what I had documented in my complaint, and that any attempt by the gym to retaliate against me for filing a legitimate complaint with a regulatory agency would only provide additional evidence of the institutional protection that had allowed Derek's behavior to continue. The corporate attorney's expression suggested that he recognized I had anticipated their retaliation threats and had prepared for them, and the meeting concluded without any additional threats being made beyond the general warning that the gym would hold me accountable for any damages resulting from what they continued to characterize as a false complaint. I left the meeting and went directly back to the main gym floor to continue my scheduled training sessions, but I noticed that several staff members were watching me with expressions that suggested they had heard about the complaint and were trying to assess whether my actions represented courageous whistleblowing or reckless antagonism of gym management. I taught my remaining classes of the day without incident, but when I returned to the staff break room at the end of my shift, I found a written notice in my mailbox informing me that my employment was being suspended, pending an internal investigation of allegations that I had violated gym policies regarding confidential business information, and that I had engaged in conduct detrimental to the gym's reputation and member relations. The suspension notice indicated that I would continue to receive my base salary during the investigation period, but that I was prohibited from entering gym property or communicating with gym members or staff except through official channels approved by gym management, and that the investigation was expected to be completed within 2 weeks, at which point I would be notified about whether my employment would be terminated or whether I would be allowed to return to work with or without additional disciplinary measures. I had anticipated that some form of retaliation would occur following my complaint submission, but I was still struck by how quickly Paul and Derek had moved to remove me from the gym environment, where I might have opportunities to discuss the complaint with other staff members or members who might be sympathetic to my concerns with firing me. Richard also explained that the suspension actually worked to my advantage because it meant I would have more time to focus on gathering additional evidence and preparing for the licensing board investigation without the distraction of maintaining my normal work schedule and managing ongoing interactions with Paul and Derek. That evening, I returned home to find Lisa waiting for me with an expression of barely controlled fury, and she immediately launched into an angry speech about how she had received calls from several of her friends who were gym members asking whether it was true that I had filed some kind of complaint against Derek that was going to result in the gym losing its franchise license and potentially closing down. Lisa demanded to know why I had not discussed my plans with her before filing the complaint, and she accused me of being more interested in destroying Derek's life than in working on repairing our marriage or moving forward in any constructive way. I told Lisa that I had not discussed the complaint with her because based on her previous reactions when I mentioned holding Derek accountable, it was clear that she was more invested in protecting Derek from consequences than in supporting my efforts to address his predatory pattern. Lisa responded by saying that I was being deliberately cruel by characterizing her concern about proportional consequences as protection of Derek, and that she was simply trying to prevent me from making decisions driven by anger and revenge that I would eventually regret once I had time to process my emotions more completely. I asked Lisa whether she had bothered to read the witness statements I had included in my complaint packet, and whether she understood that her affair with Derek was just one example in a pattern that had affected multiple women who Derek had targeted using the same manipulation tactics and the same exploitation of his position at the gym. Lisa said that she had not read the complaint materials because she did not want to be involved in what she still characterized as my vendetta against Derek, and that she thought the healthiest thing for both of us would be for me to withdraw the complaint and focus instead on our marriage and on whether we had any realistic chance of rebuilding trust and connection. I told Lisa that I had no intention of withdrawing the complaint, and that the fact she was asking me to do so suggested she still did not understand the seriousness of Derek's behavior or the harm he had caused to multiple families beyond just ours, and that her continued minimization of Derek's pattern made me question whether she was genuinely committed to acknowledging her own role in enabling his predatory conduct by participating in an affair. Margaret called the hearing to order at 3 o'clock and invited me to present the slideshow that displayed credit card charges, valet tickets, witness statements from Tanya and Andrea, and the pattern showing Derek used identical tactics with multiple married gym members over 18 months. Derek's attorney argued the relationships were consensual and private, but Margaret asked Derek directly under oath whether he had intimate relationships with other members beyond Lisa, and after hesitating, Derek admitted to 2 additional affairs, but refused to provide names. Tanya testified about conversations she had overheard and documented in her notebook where Derek boasted to Paul about developing special relationships with attractive married members. Andrea described how Derek exploited her grief after her mother's death, and how Paul dismissed her complaint when she reported feeling uncomfortable. Margaret announced the board found Derek had violated franchise conduct standards and immediately suspended his partnership authorization pending termination proceedings under the morality clause, and she ordered Paul to submit a corrective action plan within 30 days and referred the matter to the state attorney general for additional civil penalties. Derek and Paul sat stunned as Margaret concluded the hearing, and outside Lisa approached me saying she had attended and finally understood her affair was part of Derek's calculated pattern rather than the special connection she had believed it to be, and she apologized for minimizing his behavior, though I told her I still needed time to decide whether our marriage could be rebuilt after 4 months of systematic deception.